The two countries believe it is important to increase clean energy, replace fossil fuels, and at the same time reduce emissions, all the while cultivating global relationships. Well, global leaders are agreeing to establish a fund that would assist vulnerable nations cope with damage caused by climate change. CGTN's Adel Marouki reports on how frustrated leaders are trying to get enough resources to support their changes.
The first day of the climate summit ended in the UAE with many leaders voicing their frustration about the slow progress in climate action. This comes as the global stocktake of the 2015 Paris summit ended with evaluations rather disappointing in terms of progress. And leaders here want to set a new regulations and milestones for nations to achieve, as a new cycle of the global stocktake should be taking place after this COP28 concludes. One of the main announcements on this important day is the German-led Climate Club, and it's basically a coalition or a club of 36 countries who are determined to decarbonize some industries like steel, aluminum, and cement. That will happen through carbon credits and purchasing carbon products. Beside that, the UAE has announced of establishing a $30 billion climate fund dedicated to finance the most vulnerable countries, developing countries, and provide it with financing solutions for its climate-friendly projects and sustainable development at what the UAE says will be a considerable cost for financing. In general, the calls for affordable finance has been quite high from African and developing countries who have seen the world asking them to shift quickly to renewables and accelerate their ambitions in terms of relying on industries that consume and have high emissions. In general, these are the usual negotiations that will be coming on in terms of what the global leaders want to have achieved from the developing countries and what actually developing countries can afford. Adel Marouki, CGTN, Dubai.
And of course, a lot of eyes focused on Dubai right now. And joining us for more insight on what is being discussed at this year's Climate Change Conference is Paul Bledsoe. Paul is a Professorial Lecturer at American University's Center for Environmental Policy and President of Bledsoe Associates, a public policy firm. Paul, thanks very much. We certainly appreciate the time.
Thank you, Sean.
The UAE says it's going to contribute $30 billion to a new fund aiming to divert private sector capital toward climate investments and improve financing for the global south. How much of an impact is this going to make, $30 billion, to an area that is going to need a lot of financing to move it forward?
It's an important start. It is worth noting that the United States climate bill that passed about a year and a half ago has already unleashed over $200 billion in private sector investment in clean energy. But we're going to need trillions of dollars of investments to decarbonize the global economy. So we need tremendous investments by all major economies.
The role of the private sector, because clearly it is going to play a major role, but I presume that one must convince the private sector it's going to be in its best interest in the long run. So what is the role of the private sector in climate finance as well as investments?
It's a great question, Sean. I think increasingly, even the fossil fuel industry is recognizing that they need to reduce their emissions in order to continue their license to operate. Take, for example, the oil and gas industry. Right. We're expecting major announcements of methane emissions reductions by the nationally owned oil giants in Aramco, Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, Kuwait, and others. Those companies, those nationally held companies, represent 75% of all methane emissions from oil and gas. They need to make emissions reductions just like private sector companies are beginning to do so. There's a big focus at this meeting on methane emissions because cutting methane emissions are the key to limiting near-term temperatures and preventing debilitating climate change impacts. And I think the private sector will rally around a methane agreement that becomes global and eventually mandatory. I note that China and the US agreed that methane would be included in their next round of negotiations, which is good progress.
Now here, I'm sure you see the same commercials I do, that some in the gas and oil industry are putting commercials on the air saying the Democrats are pushing too fast. So what about the calls to phase out fossil fuels? How much traction is it getting? And secondly, you have to look at what happened in the U.S. between 2016 and 2020 when Donald Trump famously proclaimed the U.S. wasn't going to pay a lot of money to other countries and that climate change is just a hoax. How much did that set not only the U.S. back, but the world back? And how do you move forward? Because everybody's seen the new figures out there that show that the chance of reaching that goal of not raising temperatures above 2 degrees Celsius is just not going to happen.
Listen, I think that the private sector knows that climate change is a huge problem for all countries and all industries. I think the reduction of methane ends up paying for itself by capturing additional gas. I also believe that China needs to reduce methane from its coal mines. Methane from Chinese coal mines is 20% of all methane from all fossil fuel sources. Every country and every industry has a role here, and I believe that the private sector is moving. But in America, the U.S. has got to defeat Donald Trump. That election of Trump would be a setback for climate progress.
Yeah, it'd be very difficult to move forward. Well, the global food security efforts at COP28. First, a declaration on transforming food systems, including cutting carbon emissions in global food system, made on Friday. Talk about the significance of this declaration. And at the same time, I saw a new medical study that I believe just came out yesterday or today that talked about the dramatic warming of the Earth has caused the number of deaths globally to go up 370%. So if you don't believe in climate change, look at the numbers.
That's right. Listen, climate change is already killing thousands of people around the world. We need to prevent it from killing millions and even more. We can do this. We can reduce our emissions. The food issue is a very important one. The relationship between climate protection and food security is very tight in two ways. 30% of the world's food never reaches human consumption. We need to cut wasted food, which leads to high methane and other emissions. The other thing is, unless we get hold of methane emissions and limit global temperatures in the next decade or two, we are not going to be able to prevent the undermining of particularly subsistence agriculture in places like Southeast Asia. So there is this huge relationship between food security and climate protection, and it has to be a big part of our solution.
Paul Bledsoe, we always appreciate your time and insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.